Okay, good.
All right. So Gavin and I are back. We are now at week 6 of our 7-week course. So we are crashing towards the end here. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about chapters 5 through 8 from Wrangham's book. And then next week we'll wrap it up. Chapters 9 through, I believe, 13, and then the afterword. Gavin, did we assign the afterword? Is that on the... Yeah, it is. Yeah, I see the afterword.
Okay.
The afterword's interesting because as students, as you guys have learned now, an important part of Wrangham's argument is that execution of problematic males, for the most part, has been a recurrent feature of our evolutionary history. And he's making the rather unsettling argument, I suppose, that, and this is in the form of the execution hypothesis, the idea is that we are as cooperative, kind, and caring, and socially cohesive as we are because our ancestors routinely executed tyrants, executed ne'er-do-wells, executed men who didn't follow the rules, and occasionally women, but I think mostly you can expect it was men who were the problems. So in his afterword, Wrangham makes the case, and we'll get there next week, but I wanted to mention this. Wrangham feels compelled, I think, to make the case that he's not advocating capital punishment. He's not advocating that we should kill people who are troublemakers. He's simply arguing that our ancestors have killed people routinely and recurrently over our evolutionary history who were troublemakers. Now, we can decide as a society today that we don't agree with that. We have a moral problem with taking someone's life because of something they've done. At any rate, so it's just interesting that he felt compelled in the afterword to make it clear that he's not advocating in favor of capital punishment, despite the fact that capital punishment may well have, in his argument, been an important selective force in the building of an altruistic, cooperative, and kind psychology, as strange as the argument is. So, at any rate, we will be talking about chapters 5 through 8 today. And I also wanted to point out, just very quickly, that the additional materials we've assigned for this week, I think, are especially useful. I mean, I guess I would say that. No, I don't know if I would say that for every week. I mean, they're all excellent. All the the videos and the interviews and the podcasts that we've been assigning, excellent at a minimum in terms of helping to bring to life a lot of what we're talking about in the class. Of course, we hope you enjoy them as well, but they do have a purpose, a very clear purpose, in terms of this course. This week, we're asking you to watch a lecture by Steven Pinker on his most recent book called Enlightenment Now. That's about an hour long, and I believe there's some question and answer at the conclusion of that. Is that right, Gavin?
I think so.
There may be. Fits in nicely with the decline in violence and aggression over, human history, recent human history in particular. Then we'll ask you to watch a brief, about 15 minutes or 17-minute TED Talk by Yuval Noah Harari, who is a historian who makes an argument for what explains the rise of humans, why we and we alone are the single human species that remains today. You may or may not know, or you are learning, that there have been at least 6 human species over the past couple million years. We are the ones that remain. And I think there's some interesting arguments that Harari makes that are, frankly, quite consistent with Wrangham's arguments. And I hope you'll see that when you hear that TED Talk. And finally, we've assigned, it's about a half-hour interview with Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who are evolutionary psychologists, who have done, who since the early 80s have conducted research on human violence human aggression, homicide from an evolutionary perspective. And a lot of their work relies on anthropology, criminology, psychology, biology. And so we hope seeing and sort of, again, bring to life much of what Wrangham is discussing, although with different examples and different sort of contexts. So those are the additional talks, interviews we've assigned for this week. Now, so far, everything is going incredibly well in terms of submitting your discussion questions and responding to at least 2 of your fellow classmates' discussion questions each week, as well as submitting your reaction papers. So far, so good. And Gavin was going to make a couple of comments about how that's going. So, Gavin?
Yeah, well, I specifically wanted to mention that, since last week when we mentioned, writing more sort of specific discussion questions in response to the reading material, I've seen maybe not, but I figured as a direct result of that, a huge improvement in the discussion questions in
Awesome.
quality and in specificity. And so I really appreciate that. So thank you guys.
And how about the responses? Everybody seems to be engaged, and they seem to be sort of following along and sort of helping out their fellow students.
Yes, I definitely see a lot of people struggling through the material together in their
Good.
responses, which is awesome.
Yeah, good. I mean, here's the thing is, Gavin and I have built a class that doesn't depend on, a textbook, where all the answers are laid out, cleanly. Excuse me, I have hiccups. But instead, we're asking you to engage with the material, to think through it, to struggle with it. And hopefully you've seen that your fellow classmates also are struggling with some of the material, but that's not a bad thing. This is difficult material. It can be sometimes upsetting material, but I think it's material that everybody is certainly capable of understanding, particularly if you take advantage of your fellow classmates. And many of you have reached out to Gavin and I at various points, and we love hearing from you. So why don't we proceed while I hiccup through the next chapter?
All right.
Okay, excuse me. So chapter 5 addresses what Wrangham refers to as wild domesticates. And what he's really doing here, if you look at how he ended the previous chapter, the very last paragraph of the previous chapter on page 83, he says, regardless of how accurate or complete, well, this is actually the last full paragraph, that's not just a single sentence. He says, regardless of how accurate or complete the neural crest hypothesis is, however, Belyav's experiment with the foxes has sharpened our understanding of the domestication syndrome. What he taught us is that the domestication syndrome is produced by selection against reactive aggression, not merely by living with humans. Very important point. The implication is remarkable, says Wrangham. It means that a domestication syndrome should be produced any time that reactive aggression is selected against. Any time. Okay? Since aggressiveness must sometimes be selected against in the wild, not just in terms of human domestication, there should be many cases of domestication syndromes in the wild. Until recently, however, no one has ever looked for such a case. And that's precisely what he's going to turn to in the next chapter. Now, why he's doing this is that, remember, he's going to make the case that humans are domesticated. But who domesticated them? Well, it wasn't humans. It wasn't humans controlling the breeding of other humans. Lunatics have tried that, occasionally over human history, and it's not gone well. It's going to argue that domestication can occur in the wild, but it occurs by self-domestication rather than by some grand domesticator, as was the case, for example, with the foxes.
Right.
So in this fifth chapter, then, right at the beginning, on the first page of that fifth chapter, on page 84, Wrangham says, many wild species have experienced selection against reactive aggression. And to the extent, I'm not reading this now, I'm saying to the extent that wild species have experienced selection against reactive aggression, well, then those wild species should demonstrate the domestication syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
He's leading up to his argument that this is where we find humans. Humans are a self-domesticated species. Okay? He says that the study of wild animals should yield fascinating results, given that the domestication syndrome has nothing to do with the specifics of how humans looked after their animals. He says on page 85, whether or not a domestication syndrome can be found in the wild is therefore a critical question, both for understanding a potentially widespread evolutionary process and for helping to solve the puzzle of human docility or human apparent domestication. Okay.
And
yeah, go ahead.
He talks, I know, a lot about bonobos in this chapter, right?
He does. He's going to get there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Were there any other examples that he mentioned before that sort of stuck out to you?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, his goal, well, there are some hypothesized wild domesticates. For example, species of elephants. There's been some, sort of vague discussion about the possibility of the domestication of wild elephants, self-domestication. But what he's pointing out in part is that there's really no directed work specifically asking whether or not any wild animals have become domesticated. Bonobos were really the first targeted wild animal, okay, that was studied by Wrangham and his colleagues, okay, with an eye toward might they be self-domesticated. And I mean, part of the puzzle here is that bonobos are so closely related to chimpanzees, and yet they are so very different in their social behaviors in particular. I mean, and in ways that are directly related to the domestication syndrome. Namely, bonobos are, compared to chimpanzees, bonobos are shockingly tolerant of one another.
Right.
They're incredibly reactively unaggressive. There's very little freaking out, okay, or angry explosions that you see so typically in chimpanzees. And so one possibility is that bonobos themselves may be self-domesticated, may have domesticated themselves, and they are wild animals. And so he's going to spend some time in this chapter making the argument that bonobos are self-domesticated. You can think of them as domesticated chimpanzees in some ways.
Right, and I think he makes a really interesting argument. I don't know if we want to get into it now, because I think if I remember, he really spends most of this chapter sort of laying that out. So, let me know if I'm skipping over anything, but I think the first sort of place he starts at with this chapter and, making that argument is arguing or, setting up that they must have faced different selection pressures in order for these lower reactive aggression to have been favored. So
why? Why do you say that? Why must they have?
Because otherwise, there would be no difference. If there was not one distinct population in which reactive aggression was favored and a different distinct population in which reactive aggression was not favored or selected against, and there was not geographical separation between those two species, then they could have interbred, and they would have been able to move freely from one area to the other, and the selection pressures on them as a whole would have been largely the same. I mean, so I guess another way to put it is, and it's a good thing we read Climbing Mountain Probable before this, because I think it helps helps us understand this argument. But in order for one species to for the ancestors to become two distinct species, that's sort of the setup that you need: geographic isolation from one another and distinct selective pressures.
That's right. Exactly. And proving that point, modern bonobos and chimpanzees reside in basically the same geographical area, except one lives on one side of the Congo. It's the river, the Congo River, right?
Yep.
One lives on the other side. I think chimpanzees live in the north and on the east side, northeast, and then bonobos live south and western side.
Something like that. It's like a river that goes like across and then down, so they're kind of. And it was interesting that he mentioned that, because he said it's not a difference in latitude. It's not just that
Correct.
one's higher than the other. It's that they're just cut off from one another. And as he mentions, you don't have gorillas in the South.
Exactly. So what you have here, I mean, all of the evidence that we have to date indicates that chimpanzees and bonobos shared a common ancestor somewhere around 1 million years ago. Okay, which is just a microsecond in evolutionary time, somewhere between 880,000 and 1.9 million years ago, or something like that. Not a lot of time, and obviously that's reflected in how very similar they appear, very similar physiologically and physically. And of course, they do share much psychologically, but they also have some very important differences. And yes, so the question is, why is this? Why, on one side of the Congo, in a basically similar ecology, basically, we'll get there, do you have bonobos who are incredibly socially tolerant of one another, unreactively aggressive, and on the other side, you've got chimpanzees, who are extremely intolerant of one another, incredibly reactively aggressive. Okay, they also have all the various features that are associated with not being domesticated. Okay, relative to bonobos, chimpanzees have much larger canine teeth, which are used in intrasexual aggression and sometimes intersexual aggression. There's a much larger sex difference between males and females than is true in bonobos, and the facial structure is larger or more extended in chimpanzees than it is in bonobos. So bonobos have all of the features of domesticated species. So what is different? Well, Wrangham makes the argument that chimpanzees, but not bonobos, share an ecology with gorillas. Now, why that's relevant is that gorillas feed on the choicest foods, fruits, and other plant life that chimpanzees also would like to eat, but can't compete with gorillas for these foods. So, as Wrangham argues, what this means is that chimpanzees have to travel more widely and more distributedly. They can't move together and remain together for as long, because they have to constantly be on the sort of on the run, so to speak, for food. They have to eat, some huge portion of their day. Bonobos, on the other hand, get access to all the so-called gorilla foods. They don't have to trouble themselves with distributing themselves and traveling farther. So they have a lot more stationary time, a lot more time to just hang together. And what this means is a whole cascading series of consequences. One of the most important of which is that females hold the social power among bonobos. Females can form coalitions, okay, to basically straighten out unruly males. Males cannot achieve the equivalent of alpha status among bonobos. Quite the contrary in chimpanzees, okay, where it's males that run the show in chimpanzees. Females cannot form the kinds of coalitions in chimpanzees that bonobos can form, because they're having to be constantly on the move and distribute themselves in order to get enough food, because they're competing with gorillas.
Right. Yep. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. Yeah, just, I mean, in that small I mean, what seems like a small geographic difference, and that one less competition, gorillas for food, like you said, had that cascading effect that there's just a huge difference in the amount of reactive aggression because it wouldn't have been favored. The females could favor less reactively aggressive males, and yeah, yeah. I think that gets up to page 108, and then on page 109, he even says if we peer through it at the top of 109. If we peer through it, we should eventually expect to see the domestication syndrome. In many places, a reduction in reactive aggression should prove to be a common evolutionary phenomenon.
Right. So this is he's really spending a lot of time on the distinction between bonobos and chimpanzees because it brings to life the domestication syndrome in two very, very closely related species. And bonobos do, in fact, present all of the classic features of domestication syndrome, right down to this is his argument, the neural crest sort of hypothesis. Now, while bonobos have the pink lips, basically, whereas chimpanzees have the blackened lips. There's the absence of of coloration, the absence of, and that's not white, although they do typically have a white tuft of hair on the rear that chimpanzees don't have. So again, and this isn't a knockdown, sort of argument. I mean, it's an argument, and it's amenable to future data, but I think it's a reasonable case he's making that chimpanzees have all of the features of domesticated species, and yet they are a wild species. He's making a case for why they will have become domesticated. Anytime you select against reactive aggression, you'll get the domesticated syndrome. The argument he's making is that the shared ancestor of chimpanzees and bonobos was reactively aggressive. Okay? With the emergence of the Congo River, that population was split into two, and we know that the Congo River dates to before the splitting of chimpanzees and bonobos. With the splitting of those species, then, you have the opportunity for changes and for speciation along two different paths. And as it turns out, we know that gorillas have shared the ecology of chimpanzees, okay, and have not shared the ecology of bonobos. Why that matters is that they eat the foods that chimpanzees and bonobos prefer. That has a series of consequences for the evolutionary path that bonobos and chimpanzees have taken. Let me just jump back. He does make a very careful and thoughtful case that the shared ancestor of bonobos and chimpanzees is very likely to have been something closer to a chimpanzee. Okay, reactively aggressive, socially intolerant, large sex differences, extended canines, and all of that. And so he argues on page 98 that, this is at the top of page 98. He says, why is it so important that we know that bonobo skulls change so much? Right? I mean, if they have different skulls, bonobo skulls are juvenilized. Okay, they look more like adolescent chimpanzee skulls.
Right.
Adult bonobo skulls look like adolescent or child chimpanzee skulls. Why that's important? Okay, well, the issue is who changed relative to the ancestor. Is it that the ancestor was more juvenilized? Okay, and bonobos are simply similar to the appearance of the ancestor, and peaceability therefore, and social tolerance. Maybe that was part of the ancestral quality of the shared ancestor.
Right.
The shared ancestor of chimpanzees and bonobos. So either bonobos became more peaceable, or chimpanzees became more reactively aggressive. Okay, so what he is arguing is that it's bonobos that have changed.
Right.
Relative to the shared ancestor, not chimpanzees. And he says, on page 98, he says, okay, the skull houses the brain, and the brain directs behavior. Chimpanzee skulls retain the same ancestral style of cranial growth as gorillas and other great apes, suggesting that chimpanzee behavior has been relatively stable since they evolved from the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and bonobos. In contrast, bonobo skulls changed greatly, implying changes in bonobo brains and behavior. Okay, identification of bonobos as a species separate from chimpanzees, and then establishing that bonobos are the species to change more radically, indicates that the peaceability of bonobos is a new phenomenon, breaking away from the ancestral mold. This then is consistent with his argument that the low reactive aggression of bonobos is a newly evolved phenomenon. In other words, we can entertain a strong prediction. Middle of page 98. Bonobos should show the domestication syndrome. And the remainder of this chapter then is designed to demonstrate that bonobos do in fact display the domestication syndrome in along virtually every trait that has been sort of addressed as potentially revealing the domestication syndrome, right down to female power and female coalitions against unruly males. Okay, so he goes on to note on page 106, the bonobo's daily access to quote, appears responsible for subgroups' relative stability, okay, as is also the case with gorillas when compared with the shifting and smaller subgroups of chimpanzees. All of this matters, okay, because it makes it possible for bonobos to evolve low reactive aggression. Not just possible, but beneficial. I mean, if you are going to be in these long-standing, stable groups, reactive aggression is not going to be an effective tactic of social navigation.
Right.
He goes on to say on page 108, with females' power among bonobos came a greater ability to choose the less aggressive males as mates. I mean, given a choice, males and females prefer to interact with a less aggressive partner rather than a more aggressive partner. More aggressive partners inflict injuries, they steal food, they cause all sorts of trouble. Okay? So with female power came a greater ability to choose the less aggressive males as mates. As selection increasingly favored the less aggressive males as mates, the self-domestication syndrome emerged. Okay.
And then I think he here talks about a few studies that look at, chimpanzee interactions and how much less reactively aggressive, bonobos are. And I also thought it was interesting how he sort of presents some evidence that female homosexual behavior in bonobos, the hoka hoka, resembles the juvenile behavior in chimpanzees.
That's right. And that's repeated along a variety of traits.
Mm-hmm.
Sexuality and play. So you see that bonobos as adults are incredibly sexual and incredibly playful. Chimpanzees as children, as children and adolescents are incredibly playful and sexual. As adults, much, much less so. So bonobos have, that's part of the collection of features of domestication syndrome is as adults sharing many of the traits of childhood or adolescence. All right. So all of this is to make the case that wild species can reflect the domestication syndrome. Selection against reactive aggression can produce the domestication syndrome, even in wild species and without the involvement of humans.
Right.
Okay. In other words, in this case, bonobos are self-domesticated. They've domesticated themselves. Humans didn't domesticate bonobos. Okay? Chimpanzees didn't domesticate bonobos. Bonobos domesticated bonobos. They're self-domesticated. So chapter 6 is focused on Baliev's rule in human evolution. And he reminds us about Baliev's rule. Baliev is the Russian behavioral ecologist, geneticist who studied silver foxes and found that selection against reactive aggression produces domestication syndrome in the foxes. And Valiev didn't call it a rule. People studying Valiev's work recognize this as an apparent rule or stable sort of prediction. Namely, selection against reactive aggression produces domestication. That's Valiev's rule. Selection against reactive aggression produces the domestication syndrome.
Right.
And here we're going to apply this to humans. Okay, we're going to ask whether or not humans reflect or display the various traits of a domesticated species. And Wrangham is going to bring together a whole collection of physiological data, anthropological data, archaeological data to suggest that yes, indeed, Homo sapiens appear to be a domesticated species.
Yeah, and so I think he spends a little bit of time in the beginning sort of setting up different species and sort of picking his starting and end points for comparison, you know. And he talks about the Jebel around humans as sort of a rough starting point for comparison in the Homo genus.
Yes.
And then from there sort of takes a look at different archaeological data to basically, you know, look for and show evidence of, like you said, the domestication syndrome, which when you say that, I assume you're referring to the comorbid, like, physical adaptations that come along with the domestication.
Absolutely. But physical, but also psychological.
Right.
With regard to reactive aggression. Yeah. And I kind of like that he actually makes the case that within Homo species, within humans, he makes the argument that the best comparison. So what he's doing with humans is what he just did for chimpanzees and bonobos. Bonobos are not exactly the domesticated version of chimpanzees. That's sloppy shorthand, but we can deal with it for now. Similarly, Homo sapiens, modern humans, or Homo sapiens, represent a domesticated comparison group against, he wants to make the case, against Homo neanderthalis, or Neanderthals, right? And he argues on page 121, for example, he notes Neanderthals, well, let me back up. The study of the anatomy of Neanderthals or Neanderthals, both pronunciations are correct. The study of the anatomy of Neanderthals is helpful for understanding the evolution of Homo sapiens because, unlike our lineage, Neanderthals show no evidence of reduction in aggressive anatomy or a domestication syndrome. They're sort of like Neanderthals are to humans as chimpanzees are. I'm sorry, Neanderthals are to Homo sapiens as chimpanzees are to bonobos.
Right.
Yeah, and so he goes through a variety of comparisons. The sex difference is larger in Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. The musculature is more formidable. The skull size is larger. The midface is larger in Neanderthals relative to Homo sapiens. The bone is denser in Neanderthals relative to Homo sapiens. If you look at now Neanderthals don't have canines, but I believe the tooth structure and the size of teeth is larger. The size of the jaws, the brow ridge. Again, relative to humans, places humans, that is modern humans, Homo sapiens, places Homo sapiens into what we would call domesticated version of Neanderthals.
And that adult Homo sapien skeletons resemble adolescent Neanderthal remains.
That's exactly right. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have fossils, as he mentioned. We don't have a fossil record for chimpanzees and bonobos. But if we look at modern chimpanzees and bonobos, once again, you have adult bonobos looking very similar in skeletal structure to adolescent chimpanzees. Same for Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. Homo sapien adults have a skeletal structure and frame that looks reasonably close to adolescent or child Neanderthals. Yeah, I mean, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but the idea is all of this is building the case that Homo sapiens are a domesticated species. But given that no one or no thing domesticated them, well, then they must be self-domesticated. But if that's true, then how did that happen? Right? How could that have happened? Selection against reactive aggression must have occurred.
Right.
Okay? If you follow Baliev's rule, okay, and which seems to accurately capture every other instance of domestication. Selection against reactive aggression. Going on here, let's see, on page 126. Just kind of bringing it together in one place here. Let's see, he says, the other kind of explanation involves finding a series of, okay, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. As I've noted in chapter 3, different features of Homo sapiens have been argued to be individually related to such factors as warm climates or cooking, better hunting weaponry, or falling body weight. These and many other suggestions imply a whole variety of causes for a variety of effects. Some or all may be relevant, at least to some extent. Then he goes on to say, but those one-by-one ideas do not solve the problem that Helen Leach, an earlier anthropologist, identified. Why are the characteristic features of Homo sapiens congruent with the domestication syndrome found in animals? Okay. Leach's persuasive solution was that the reason that human features are described by the domestication syndrome is simple. Humans are a domesticated species. Okay? That's why we have all these features. We don't need to one by one explain, the special evolution of each one of these characteristics. As a matter of fact, it's much more parsimonious to argue that humans have undergone selection against reactive aggression and as a consequence experience the standard domestication syndrome. Okay. So I'm looking at the end of chapter 6, bottom of page 126. He's kind of bringing this together. And he says, to understand why humans exhibit the domestication exhibit the domestication syndrome, we must identify a mechanism, a specific selective force that could have operated throughout the time of Homo sapiens. The factor or factors responsible for domestication must apply to our species as a whole, which means that it goes back at least 60,000 years, and probably to the genetic root of our species around 300,000 years ago. Okay? Because all humans display these features. Okay? All the different geographical groups or races or ethnicities display the same pattern of findings. Okay? All humans appear to be domesticated, not just the earliest group that leaves from one continent into another. It's universal. Okay? The selective force must also be unique to humans, that is, to Homo sapiens, not occurring in Neanderthals or other species of Homo. Okay? Because we're the only ones that display this domestication syndrome of the 6 or so human species. Most importantly, the mechanism must explain how the propensity for reactive aggression is reduced. Okay? Precisely such a mechanism was hinted at by Charles Darwin, okay, and has been elaborated by Christopher Behm. Their proposal accounts for the emergence of the domesticated syndrome in Homo sapiens by reduction of reactive aggression through punishment of reactive aggression imposed by humans on ourselves. The short phrase that he uses for this is the execution hypothesis. That's one way to select for reactive unaggression. One way to select against reactive aggression is to flat out kill people who display it.
Right.
And that effectively is going to be the argument that he makes. Okay, and it's unsettling because it's these repeated executions over evolutionary history that have produced the generally docile, socially tolerant, and reactively unaggressive modern human species.
Yeah. Yeah, and so he needs to set up, I think, sort of a selective pressure or like an environment in which this would be favored. Where I don't think an explanation similar to that used for bonobos would really work for humans, who I think at the time of this selection probably would have occupied a larger like expanse than bonobos would have. So just geographic access to food may not quite have done it as an explanation. But so in chapter 7, he sort of sets that up by talking about the tyrant problem, and basically says that the threat of, or I guess the consequences of being sufficiently horrible in a group of humans would have been dire enough to elicit possible executions or coalitions of men.
So why might that be? I mean, he's going to argue that this is peculiar to humans. Well, the tyrant problem. Well, what he wants to argue is that human evolutionary history has recurrently evidenced, phenomenon in which adult males attempt to bully others and attempt to grab a hold of more than their fair share, whether it's territory or mates or children in terms of reproduction. But this is a devastating sort of behavior to display in a group that relies crucially on social cohesiveness and intense tolerance of one another. An unruly, tyrannical male is devastating for a group that depends fundamentally on effective social relationships.
Right. And it's, it must have been, because otherwise, displaying more aggression and trying to take, more food and more mating opportunities should, in a lot of situations in non-human species, be an advantageous trait. Being more aggressive, being a bigger bully, that's what you see in chimpanzees. So you do have to sort of set up a situation in which doing these things is the opposite of adaptive, basically.
And furthermore, I mean, in humans, it's an ever-present allure for males, for adult males. The possibility, I mean, given language and given the various cognitive sorts of adaptations that humans have, adult males can grab a hold of, extraordinary power and resources, and they can inflict tyrannical nastiness on other males and females. It seems to be sort of a recurrent lure, a possibility. And so males over human evolutionary history, adult males have sought this occasionally. But what that evolutionary history also indicates is that with some, sufficient probability, those males have not in the long run succeeded because they've been ostracized, excommunicated, and, according to Wrangham, executed. Right, but these are often bigger, larger, stronger males. And so what's required here is a group of males getting together, a coalition of males getting together, because one-on-one tyrannical males can wreak havoc, just like in chimpanzees. And so it requires a coalition of adult males, what I think Wrangham refers to as the tyranny of cousins. Requires a coalition of adult males working together, gossiping, discussing, planning, to undo this guy, to bring him down. And it has to be a collaborative effort, but that's something that is possible in humans in a way that it's certainly not as possible in, for example, chimpanzees. Although there is evidence that chimpanzee males also build political coalitions to bring down alpha males, but not with the kind of recurrence or regularity as has been true over human evolution for humans.
Right, right. I know that they can sort of form bonds and overthrow like an alpha, but I think as Wrangham has mentioned a few times throughout the book, there's really no evidence that they can plan in the same way that humans can, and their capacity for language doesn't really allow for gossip in the way that's necessary in order to talk about a specific individual and plan to take him down.
That's right. So this chapter, then, what Wrangham is setting out as clearly as he can, which I think is quite clearly, is that this is a problem. A recurrent problem over human evolution is the problem of tyrannical males. The problem, which is what I was sort of clumsily referring to as the lure of access to extraordinary resources and the lure of inflicting bullying behavior on others, the lure for adult males, because the potential payoffs are huge if you can grab a hold of this power and wield it. That has selected, given the nature of humans, given the nature of Homo sapiens, it's selected in Homo sapiens for a psychology that motivates less tyrannical males to work together, okay, to undo or to bring down these bullies.
Right.
So what we're dealing with here is the adaptive problem, the tyrant problem. So on page 141, at the very last paragraph, he says, the only proposal sufficient to explain how our ancestors overcame the problem of determined bullies, tyrants, which was surely a vital first step to elaboration of cooperative behavior, is the elaboration of Darwin's idea that, quote, violent and quarrelsome men, end quote, came to a, quote, bloody end. Yeah, it's kind of cool that Darwin actually was prescient about this. I mean, it's really neat. It's neat that Wrangham recognized this in some of Darwin's writings. And then he goes on, Wrangham goes on to say, the execution hypothesis claims that during the Pleistocene, okay, over the last couple million years of human evolution, a new kind of ability crystallized. For the first time, coalitions of males became effective at deliberately killing any member of their social group who was prepared to use violence on his own behalf and simply did not care what others thought about him. In the end, execution was the only way to stop such a male from being a tyrant. Okay? Which leads us into chapter 8, capital punishments. Okay? Execution. And in this chapter, Wrangham's going to make the argument, and I actually think it's, maybe in hindsight, once you read this argument, perhaps it seems obvious. But it was not obvious until Wrangham and others made the argument that capital punishment, that is, execution, has been a recurrent feature of human evolutionary history and human recent history.
Mm-hmm.
And Wrangham makes the case, based on the data available, that execution of tyrants, okay, is cross-culturally universal, it's cross-historically universal, and it's known in every culture for which we have data. This is how humans the world over and for all of recorded history have dealt with tyrants, bullies. If they couldn't be handled otherwise, they've killed them.
Right. Well, and he starts the chapter by saying, or talking about one of the last, I think he said it was one of the last executions in American history for, what, like a minor crime, like a non-violent offense?
Right.
So he starts off by saying that, you know, the talking about the decline of capital punishment, especially in the Western world over the past like 200 years. But then he sort of takes us back and talks about how common it had been throughout history. And I don't know if he says it in the book, but I know in his video, his Harvard lecture, he says that, you know, in until more recently, there wasn't really any option. You didn't have jails to put people in or rehabilitation facilities for people with, you know, violent or sexual misconduct. Uh,
Right.
Execution was really the only viable option, other than maybe ostracization. But if they were like a bully or they threw their weight around, that may not have been the most attractive of those options.
Yeah, I like how he, on page 153, this kind of brings it all together here. He says, well, at least for the moment, he says, the decisive form of social control is right in the middle of page 153. The decisive form of social control represented by the killing or execution of aggressive males could clearly have had far-reaching significance. With regard to the idea that Homo sapiens self-domesticated, the critical question is whether individuals with a particularly high propensity for reactive aggression tended to be killed. Okay? The characteristic fact of egalitarian relationships where no male has any more legitimate power or bullying ability than any other male. Okay? The fact of egalitarian relationships indicates that the execution of would-be despots was indeed systematic. Okay? I mean, if you kill would-be despots, you're left with egalitarianists, right? You're left with the males who can, sort of keep the boat rowing in the egalitarian waters and don't put their head up too high and don't get too cocky, too sure of themselves, start becoming bullies. Then he says that even now, although married hunter-gatherer men normally respect one another's autonomy, occasional individuals have been reported trying to control others. Like alpha chimpanzees, these would-be despots defend their top status by reacting ferociously to challengers. In a world without prisons or police, those bullies whose reactive aggression was particularly egregious could be stopped only by execution. Thus, the egalitarianism found among all mobile hunter-gatherers indicates that the most aggressive individuals were eliminated. Okay? The ironic and disturbing conclusion, according to Wrangham, is that egalitarianism, a system that appeals because of its lack of domineering behavior, is made possible by the most domineering behavior in the human arsenal, namely execution, coalitionary execution. It's a simple, but I think a very powerful idea.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty convincing. I think it's interesting that he, you know, sort of talks about the different societies in which, you know, you see groups of men making decisions together and very little vying for power, not necessarily because no individual wants to increase their amount of control or their wealth or whatever, but because these are, you know, the men or the ancestors of the men who were able to, you know, keep themselves in check for
That's right.
fear of execution or for fear of retaliation.
Yeah, and actually that point leads me to, I think, another very important point a few pages later on page 159, and where Wrangham argues the fear of capital punishment, the fear of execution, he argues, can doubtless contribute to encouraging a spirit of conformity and restraint. Right? So in other words, the recurrence of execution, okay, for tyrannical behavior selects for that are very sensitive to not making themselves the target of execution, to maintaining calmness and cohesiveness and social camaraderie and restraint, okay, lest you find yourselves, okay, at the pointy end, of a coalition of males who have had it with you, right? Okay.
And well, yeah, and that there seemed to be very little tolerance for it. And I think here somewhere he talked about the Alaskan or Inuit
Right.
um, individual who was killed by his village for, uh, I think killing someone and taking their wife or
Right.
something
A
like
few
that.
times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the guy was just not letting up. I mean, you know, they were giving him multiple chances, and
Right.
finally concluded that he's got to go. He's got to go. And that kind of situation, according to Wrangham, and according to the evidence, is repeated across cultures and across historical time periods, and according to Wrangham, is part of our evolutionary history. And then he goes on to make the case that gossip itself, our fascination with talking about others, who's doing what with whom, why, where are they, who said what, she said that, humans' incessant obsession with social gossip. And I think some recent work suggests that something like some shocking percentage of time, uh, uh, of time and of the content in gossip is social in nature. And it's things like who's doing what to whom, okay, who said what about whom. It's reputationally related. And Wrangham is making the argument that gossip solves what he's calling the coordination problem by allowing individuals to test their feelings cautiously and to generate shared plans. It's part of the very complex and rich process of getting to execution. Why people care so deeply about what others think of them.
Right.
Why people care so deeply about not unduly upsetting, you know, would-be executioners. I mean, this is the argument he's making.
Yeah. Yeah, and it at least feels like a strong argument. And I just really like the sort of cautious process of gossiping because you don't want
Yeah,
to, you know, throw something out and then have it backfire. Essentially,
that's right.
gossip has to be tactful in order to be effective.
Full, and it has to be disguised sometimes. There will be suggestions that can be, defended as that's not what I meant. I mean, it's all part of this navigational process of assessing what others think, which is crucial because, would-be tyrants can't be dispatched by individuals. Would-be tyrants can only be dispatched by groups of, Wrangham will argue, adult males that are working together, okay, to bring down, okay, a tyrant.
Right.
So he's going to sort of unpack this argument that our concerns with right and wrong and are we behaving properly? Are we rocking the boat too much? Is somebody else behaving improperly? Are they rocking the boat? Are they sort of morally improper? I mean, Wrangham's going to make the argument in a couple of chapters that our morality, our moral psychology evolved in part as a solution to the problem of execution for socially disruptive behavior. Because ancestral humans routinely and recurrently executed those who challenged the cohesive nature of the group, well, then that's selected, according to Wrangham, for our evolved moral psychology, our incessant concern with what other people think and say about us, and our concern with what other people are thinking and doing. It's all built on, this solving the problem of execution for socially damaging behavior.
Okay. So he will spend more time in the next few chapters talking about, I guess, more of the mechanisms and the inner workings that are sort of necessary psychologically for this to have taken place, because it seems to require a lot,
Yeah,
when you sort of peel back the veil, in order for all of this to happen. Not only the selective pressures against reactive aggression, but the you know forming of coalitions and the carrying out of executions.
right. Oh yeah. I mean, you would anticipate. I actually think that Wrangham unstated. I think that's where we can, offer our sort of comments. It's not that what he's arguing is is. I actually buy his argument, but he does leave unpacked. No, he leaves packed. A lot of the underlying psychology. I mean, what he's proposing is an argument that depends on a very complex, evolved psychology that motivates successful and effective coalitionary behavior, right? And that motivates effective and successful sort of moralizing. Now, he is going to discuss the evolution of right and wrong in a couple of chapters. And he'll spend some time making the argument that our moral psychology is a product of a recurrent history of execution of would-be tyrants. Um, Now, I actually think that his argument I actually think he's probably right, but he does not specify he doesn't give you a lot of the details. I mean, in part because he doesn't know them. Nobody knows them. I think what he's doing is he's opening up a new vista, a new area for potential research to unpack what must be buried in psychology to make all of this work.
Okay.
I mean, we can cut Wrangham some slack in some sense because he's not a psychologist,
Right.
not fundamentally interested in the information processing modules of the mind. He's painting, to his credit, a much broader picture. He's painting the broad outline, and it's up to subsequent researchers to start filling in, what is hypothesized to be there. The psychology that motivates concerns with right and wrong, the psychology that motivates moralizing, the psychology that motivates and facilitates cooperative and coalitional behavior.
Right.
Not going to spell out those details to any, to any extent that a psychologist, an evolutionary psychologist, might be satisfied with. I mean, for my money, you can't do everything. And he's painting with broad brushstrokes, what could become, many, many careers worth of investigations to sort of unpack the presumed or hypothesized psychology that exists.
Right. And I think even still, being broad, he still makes a really good case for the psychology at least being there. And, there's a
Sure.
lot of research that does look at gossip and looks at perceptions of morality, especially a lot of interesting stuff with infants. And I know there's a Paul Bloom lecture. There's two Paul Bloom lectures later in the class. I think that must be next week.
Yes. Yes. Next week.
And a lot of this stuff is already there, and a lot of other people have already made really strong arguments for the adaptive benefit, for different adaptive benefits for gossip and morality and sort of inherent morality, which is some of the stuff we see in infants, already being there. And there's no reason why tyrannical males couldn't have added further selective pressure for some of those things, for the function of gossip and for sort of inherent ideas of justice and morality.
You would expect, or you might hypothesize, that these various features would be part of evolved psychology, even potentially from very early in development.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I like that towards the end of this chapter, he really makes a strong case well, a strong argument anyways. He makes the argument that that language is really a crucial sort of element of this, you know, bigger picture he's painting. And he says, in short, this is on page 164, in short, the ability to murmur about how much we resent some other individual, okay, gossip that is, and to float the idea of doing something drastic about it has certainly been part of the human legacy for at least a few thousand generations. If competent language began to develop 500,000 years ago, its increasing social significance would help explain how our ancestors started controlling the alpha males and thereby bred a new kind of human. Obviously not on purpose, but bred by default. In this model of self-domestication, language was the key feature of Homo sapiens that allowed many tools of social control, from gossip to killing. Something you don't see in other species. I mean, language is uniquely human. Language, in terms of what we understand language to be. We're not talking about just some means of communication, but a recursive, sort of psychology that motivates recursive language.
Right.
I also appreciated his sort of recognition that, if you're going to pursue execution, well, then certain things have to be sort of set up properly. I mean, for example, he goes on to say, he reflects on a particular episode among the Yanomamo hunter-gardeners, and he says, unsuspecting, he laid down his weapons before climbing up this tyrannical male. His assassins were now safe. They gathered the victim's weapons and merely had to wait for him to come down before easily killing him. The episode recalls a way that some organized crime kills supposedly have occurred, planned for weeks, until the victim sat in a car next to a driver with his killer poised behind him to strike. The importance of ensuring that the victim is helpless at the time of the attack dramatizes the importance of attackers sharing their intentions with one another. You got to be super planful and organized about this. Making plans by using language. Language, whether gestural or spoken, makes the sharing of intentions sufficiently sophisticated for scared, frustrated, and resentful men to devise a safe plot against the tyrants. You can't do that stuff without very complex intentionality and sharing of plans. And he says here, on page 166, without language, the task seems impossible. I therefore infer that the vital human novelty that propelled the origin of a new kind of political system was plotting, the ability to plot together. Rather than the ability to make weapons, surely determined when the change occurred in the balance of power between the classic alpha male type and the new coalition of subordinates. You have to be able to plot. There's no indication that chimpanzees can plot.
And it's, I feel like that is sort of an interesting parallel to the domestication in bonobos, where, the one sort of thing that, maybe not the one, but the major crux of it was the ability of females to stick together during foraging in order to defend against aggressive single alpha males, is just forming groups.
Right. So there you have selection against reactive aggression that doesn't turn on executing tyrannical males.
Right.
It turns on females having the power, coalitionary power, okay, to tamp down tyrannical male behavior.
But here it's, the ability of males and also females to gossip about other people, and in order to, and if necessary, to plot to execute them.
That's right. Yeah, that's it. All right. Well, good. So that brings us to the conclusion of this week's chapters, right? And next week, we will see this argument through, okay? And we'll see what we think about Wrangham's developing argument once we wrap it up next week. I think the most interesting piece is this business, or an interesting piece. He's going to apply this argument to the evolution of moral psychology. I think it's a very interesting argument. I think it's speculative, but I think he just might be right. And that's part of what we can spend a little time talking about next week. Then he also addresses war and warfare and where that fits in with human virtuousness in violence. Finally, as I mentioned, uh, he'll spell out in the afterword that while execution has been an important selective force that's built our cooperative and socially, concerned psychology, he's not in any way suggesting that therefore execution is good or that capital punishment should be advocated. Quite the contrary when we get there. Um, all right, so anything else, Gavin?
No, nope.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll continue to hear from many of you guys as you have questions and concerns, and we'll look forward to seeing your next round of discussion questions and responses and your reaction papers. But until next week, we will hope to hear from you soon.
All right, thanks.